if we understand that this is a national security issue, that these things function not unlike, the highway system, which is a common carrier system. It is owned by the federal government. There's no reason why, we could theoretically rent out, you want time on our federally owned tracks. You can do that. We charge tolls and gasoline tax. We could do some similar situation for trains and organizing it that way. So the logistical standpoint and the philosophical, I guess, idea, it's not that hard to wrap our heads around. What would it take? Like, what are the methodologies in which if we were to nationalize the trains, like, how would that happen? Would we need legislation? Would we need, what kind of authority would the U.S. government need to do something like this?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, there's two probably basic models where it could happen. One, if the government took over the entire industry, including the actual companies like BNSF that do the shipping. I mean, that would be a pretty huge deal and probably not likely anytime soon. But what you described is the case in many countries. I mean, the full nationalization is the case in many countries too. But the government owning the tracks and charging or offering concessions to use the tracks, like that's, as you said, a very straightforward model to imagine. So for that to actually happen, I mean, on just sort of a common sense, ethical level, given that all this land was given to the railroads and that they've had the chance over so many decades to profit off it, it seems like the railroads would sort of owe something back to the country in return. But, legally and constitutionally, that would involve taking private property. Eminent domain is often used to take land, but of course, you still have to compensate. And say in cases where electric utilities have been municipalized or there's been attempts to municipalize them, which means the local government taking them over, they owe a lot of money to the companies, the utility companies, for those assets. In this case, the electric wires that the utility companies built and maintained over all that time. So, the government could theoretically basically buy the tracks and the lands back from the railroads. We'd be talking about massive amounts of money. And then there's in the past,
let me ask you
railroads.
This. I'm curious about this. Like, if I'm coming in on building a highway, I'm a city, I'm building a highway, and I take people's houses or their buildings where there was business taking place there. I'm responsible to pay for the value of the land and maybe the structures, but not necessarily for the profits that could have been made because of that location, right? Like, I mean, I had a hot dog stand here on this corner, and it was a very valuable piece of real estate where it was. I can move my hot dog stand down the road, but there's no foot traffic there, and I'm not going to make as much money. Like, I guess that's part of the issue there, like, right? I mean, like, they've doubled their profits in 16 years. That doesn't necessarily give you a sense of what the value of that operation is if it was run in a way that is supposed to service what it's supposed to service, right? Like, I mean,
if there was any measure of redundancy that would be proportionate to what, I mean, just in terms of like, yeah, I mean, just and never mind redundancy. I mean, like they're causing price increases down the line. They're causing bottlenecks. They're causing delays. They're also, causing huge safety concerns. But I guess there would be that would all be in negotiation. So that's a tough road to hoe. But what about, you also suggest buying the shares of these companies, and the sort of the precedent there is what the U.S. government did for, I think it was a GM, in the wake of the financial crisis. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and that's a model of nationalizing that's actually been proposed by some prominent people for the fossil fuel industry as well. So that's just sort of working within our, well-accepted capitalist system to buy up stock in a company until you basically own and control the company. And that would be, in that case, the whole hog, not just the tracks, but that would be buying up power in, the entire company. So that seems like it would be something that would be doable. Again, it would be absolutely massive amounts of money, and I'm sure there'd be various legal wrangling that would go on. But it's something that's happened in the hostile ways or bailout, quote unquote, bailout ways plenty of times in the past. So that is another model that's been put out there.
Is there anybody in Congress who has done any work on researching this, on proposing legislation to this effect? I mean, because I on some level, I think this is pretty far-fetched. It can't happen. But also, then you think about what happened in East Palestine, and maybe we're a couple of those away from a real, reckoning as to why do we have something there's absolutely, I guess there's an argument that if you really want different flavors of soda, you need to have a bunch of different soda companies out there, and you don't want the government to own all the soda companies because you'll just get one flavor. I mean, I'm just stretching here, but there doesn't seem to be any rational argument as to why there is an iota of value that these things are privatized, and there is multiple arguments as to why it is a detriment to the national security of this country. So is there anybody out there who's proposed legislation? Is this one of those things that perennially comes up? Is there a lawmaker out there who's been sort of beating this drum?
I mean, in terms of lawmakers, I'm pretty sure not. It is a pretty politically a political stretch to start taking private property from these massive companies. So as far as I know, there aren't lawmakers talking about it, but lawmakers have acknowledged that this industry is in crisis, and they did pass a law, obviously, last fall to crush the strike. So, they were willing to take that kind of action. But it really, in terms of some degree of nationalization, it really is so far the workers and some pundits who are pushing that argument. And, it may take some time, a lot of time maybe, for it to percolate up to lawmakers. But, when things are in crisis, things can happen quickly. And this debate is getting more prominent. So who knows, maybe it is something that will be discussed sooner than we would have expected in actual Congress or the administration.
Yeah, well, with labor behind it, it needs to be discussed more. And there needs to be, I think, a lawmaker that takes up that mantle. But even in the more immediate term, right? I loved how you, in your piece, had two different tracks that we just kind of laid out, the horizontal separation, or the one that might be easier, the one that's the vertical one. But how about antitrust in the short term? These regional monopolies are so... that's a big part of the problem too, right? They just have a chokehold in their area of the country. Would that be a viable option to move forward, at least in the short term?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's also being discussed and is much more likely to happen. And I think is, sort of in the works to some degree, because the regulators do already have the power to approve or deny mergers among these companies. And in the past, they've pretty much always approved them. But and especially the shippers, a lot of companies increasing competition as opposed to nationalizing is a much more comfortable model. And, ironically, in this situation, you can achieve some of the same goals possibly by increasing competition or nationalizing, because the goal in both cases is breaking up the stranglehold that these handful of companies have on the industry. But, I know a lot of the workers would much rather see the nationalization model, and more competition could have benefits for workers and the industry, but that could also go off the rails as well. But that is the more realistic thing that would happen soon, I think.